Hi, in this presentation we're going to talk about the diversity paradox some more. Um, in this part two, we'll talk about changing patterns of multicultural identification and intermarriage rates across racial groups. So we finished off the last time talking about the U.S. Census, and the year 2000 was the first time that people could identify with more than one race. Lee and Bean argue this has had a powerful effect in the ways in which Americans think about racial boundaries as sort of essentially um, led to those boundaries being more permeable, less rigid, and people don't think of race as in the same rigid way as they did in the past as a result of this change in 2000. Um, it's interesting to think of some of their projections about the year 2100 and the percentage of people from different racial groups that would identify as multiracial. And this is obviously being driven by increased rates of intermarriage. Yeah. So, for example, 95% of American Indians, 70% of Hispanics, 43% of Asians, 37% of blacks, and 35% of whites would be identifying as multiracial come the year 2100. So so that's looking forward. If you look looking in the past, the recent past, since 1970, there's been a profound change in the composition of the population in the United States. The percentage of the population that identify as white has dropped by 17%. To give you some context, in 2008, to have the same number, same percentage of whites as existed in 1970, there would have to be 50 million more whites in 2008. So whites are becoming a much smaller proportion of the U.S. population. Soon they may become a minority in the U.S. overall, and this has caused quite a bit of anxiety among some whites who have benefited from this privileged position of being a majority racial group. So there's also an interesting question about where is this diversity taking place. Some places have changed quite a bit in terms of the racial composition. Others have been more stagnant. So the diversity, increases in diversity tend to be concentrated in large and richer states. So on the coasts, in particular, California, New York, and Florida, for example. But other states, many states in the middle of the geographic middle of the country, have had relatively little change in their racial composition. What I find fascinating here is that Lee and Bean make an argument that the states with the greatest level of diversity are also states are being more economically successful, which suggests that diversity increases productivity. And I'll leave it to the economists to try to figure out why that is the case, but it's a fascinating trend. So not only we're looking at intermarriage, not only are Latinos and whites intermarrying with whites at higher rates, but these rates of intermarriage are increasing in each successive generation, and they are associated with increases in income and education. So as people get more income or higher levels of income, higher levels of education, they're more likely to intermarry. So some of the statistics about this intermarriage, if you go back to 1960, there were 150,000 intermarriages, and in 10 years later, 1970, there was twice as many. There was 300,000. By 1980, it was three times that number, 900,000. And by the year 2000, it was another over three times the number again, 3.1 million. So at that time, made up 6.2% of all marriages, which is, as you can see, the trend is a significant, consistent increase in the number of intermarriages. And who are more likely to engage in intermarriage? Well, people who are more highly educated. Lee and Bean argue that this is likely due to increased tolerance, that people who are more highly educated are more tolerant and therefore more likely to intermarry, and also people who come from smaller racial groups. This is likely due to the fact that they are less likely to meet um, people from their same racial group if they come from a small group. The people that they're interacting with are more likely to be from a different racial group, which it enhances the likelihood of intermarriage. Um, Interestingly, as we talked in the Dalmage presentation, um, blacks sometimes view intermarriage with whites as a sign of disloyalty, and so that may stand in the way of them engaging in intermarriage, as opposed to, and you also, of course, have of whites who may resist um, or oppose intermarrying with blacks in a way that they don't with other groups. Now, among Asian white and Latino white intermarried couples, what they find is interesting is that race seems to be a non-factor in terms of a barrier to intermarriage for them and their families and their friends. The differences tend to be, or the struggles tend to be related to culture or language, um, but uh, they tend to view um, being Asian or Latino is much closer to white than black. Also, um, Asians and Latinos in the individuals that they interviewed frequently reported that marrying blacks would have been seen as seriously opposed by their families in a way that marrying whites was not. So, um, and also many of the Asians and Latinos who did marry blacks reported that their families often severed ties with them, sort of disowned them, except this is temporary in the sense that what the general pattern is once their grandchildren are born, then the people are accepted back into their family. The Asians and Latinos are accepted back once the grandchildren are born. Lee and Bean also talk about some fascinating patterns with the children of interracial families. That is, the children of Asian white and Latino white interracial families are more likely to identify as Asian or Latino if they have certain characteristics. For example, if they live in a metropolitan area with a large number of co-ethnics, then they're more likely to identify as Asian or Latino as opposed to white. Yeah. Also, if the ethnic language is spoken at home, or if it's their father who is the non-white parent. All three of these characteristics lead to a greater uh, ethnic identity associated with being either Asian or Latino rather than white. Um, Also, these parents of the Asian white or Latino white children taught their kids that they would likely become white, seen as white, but none of the black white interracial parents felt this way or taught their kids to think this way. So essentially, the Asian white and Latino white interracial families were seen as acting white by their parents, regardless of their efforts to try to instill a culture, pride, or to teach them about their ethnic culture. Um, these parents were frustrated often because these multiracial children of theirs were more likely to be seen as just acting white. Also, few of these children were exposed to consistent and authentic culture that is from their Asian or Latino parents. Most often, their exposure, rather than be authentic, was more situational and symbolic rather than a constant presence. It's interesting, the children of black and white multiracial families were almost always identify as black. And I think this has got to do with the external imposition of race and how race is more rigidly defined externally for blacks and less of a choice. There are also interesting differences when it comes to gender and interracial marriage rates. It's fairly constant across whites, American Indians, and Latinos, but there was gender patterns for Asians and blacks. Specifically, Asian females and black males were much more likely to intermarry than were Asian males and black females. Also, Lee and Bean found that for children in these multiracial children, ethnic clubs and churches tended to pull them away from identifying as Asian. And the argument here is that the presence of these groups tended to exclude them, or that these churches or clubs would not really accept multiracial Asians because they weren't seen as fully Asian. And this is a pattern that Lee and Bean describe as flowing from an elitism among the Asian population. The opposite was the case for Mexican culture. They seem to be much more accepting of interracial marriages and the resulting multiracial youth. These children from Mexican multiracial families felt more accepted and therefore more likely to identify with their Mexican ethnicity. A big part of this was whether or not they spoke the ethnic language. For all groups, speaking the ethnic language was a powerful predictor of identifying with that ethnic group as opposed to identifying as white. And so youth who were unable to speak the given language were often excluded because of that inability to speak the language. Also, it's interesting to think about how what group a person is from will shape how narrowly or broadly their race or ethnicity is imposed upon them. That is much more likely to be imposed upon someone who is multiracial with some black ancestry. For example, celebrities like Christina Aguilera, Cameron Diaz, or Keanu Reeves, those individuals are more likely to be seen as white, as opposed to someone like Halle Berry, who's also multiracial, is more likely to be defined as black. Also, it's interesting patterns that take place in social institutions such as the schools or legal system. Often, schools push black, white, multiracial children to identify simply as black, and it's again an example of the external imposition of race, as can racial profiling that the legal system may treat multiracial children or adults who are black and some other ethnic group. They would simply be treated as black. Also, being find that the black community often can call into question the racial authenticity of multiracial individuals. For example, former President Obama was accused of not being black enough, despite the fact that his self-identification is as a black man, but people were critical of him being not black enough. Also, the Asian and Latino multiracial people often adopt their ethnic identities in symbolic ways. One of the more interesting examples of this is the adoption of a pan-ethnicity as being Asian in general rather than a country-specific, for example, like being Chinese. And so Lee and Bean found that some Chinese multiracials would consider, for example, eating sushi as a reflection of their Asian heritage, despite the fact that sushi is not associated with Chinese culture, but rather Japanese culture. So it suggests that this is not an authentic Asian or authentic Chinese ethnicity, but rather is adopted simply symbolically. In general, multiracial individuals will embrace their non-white identity or ethnicity as situationally. That is, they'll do it when they think it's going to benefit them. For example, maybe when they're applying for college, they'll claim their ethnicity, but they don't on a day-to-day basis. Also, Lee and Bean are critical of this strategy that, for example, if a multiracial black family or a multiracial Latino family who is not disadvantaged, particularly an Asian or a Latino multiracial family that in which the children are able to pass as white, but then they use affirmative action policies to gain admission into a college, for example, Lee and Bean would say that that's problematic because it flies in the face of the point of what affirmative action policies are intended to do, and that is to address discrimination that might take place because of a person's race. Ironically, the parents who are bothered by the imposition of race, for example, multiracial parents in black-white relationships, their children, they may be bothered when their children are pushed to identify as black, but these are also often the same parents who, when applying to college, make a point of having their children identify as black because they see it as an increasing likelihood of them being accepted to their college choice. Asians, on the other hand, were much less, or Asian multiracials were much less likely to see claiming Asian identity as providing them any benefit. And I think that's probably played out in this example of college admissions. So there's a couple of broad theoretical ideas about race that Lee and Bean talk about. One is being the contact hypothesis, and the other being group threat theory. In short, the contact hypothesis suggests that as diversity increases, there will be more acceptance and less hostility between racial groups because people, when they have more contact with someone from a different racial background, that dispels negative stereotypes, and people realize that there's not, the stereotypes don't hold. And so the argument here is that the diversity would increase tolerance, and as opposed to group threat theory that suggests that it suggests the opposite, that as the size of a particular group grows, and they would potentially pose a threat to the dominant group, and that would result in more resistance and so forth. And both of these theories have implications for predicted intermarriage rates or multicultural identification, but they make predictions in the opposite direction. So the result of this book is more consistent with the contact hypothesis, at least in the case of Asians and Latinos. That when there is more diversity, that's going to increase the intermarriage rates and the multiracial identification for all those groups, but not as strong for blacks because of the group threat process that I described just a moment ago. Okay, so that's the ideas that are presented in Lee and Bean's book. If you have any questions or comments, please post them on our course website, and thank you very much for listening.